Hello everybody. My name is Michael. I'm coming from Edinburgh in the UK. And this work is about using genetic programming to evolve both local and population-based optimizers. And in particular, I'm looking at whether these optimizers can be evolved from scratch, or at least broadly from scratch at the instruction level. And then whether these evolved optimizers can be analyzed and useful knowledge about how the optimization is extracted from them. And specifically, I'm using PushGP to do this and seeing whether PushGP is a suitable means of both expressing and evolving the optimizers. And for this paper, I'm focusing on continuous functions, so continuous landscapes. This is mostly because I'm more familiar with these and they're easier to visualize. But there's not really any fundamental reason why this approach couldn't also be applied to discrete landscapes, which I know a lot of people here are interested in. So the optimizers we use are designed by humans, and we know that humans are fairly biased in the way we think about things. We have this common idea in evolution computing that the space of designs which are produced by humans are only a subset of those of the overall design space. And it seems likely this is also the case for optimizers. So in the past, we've had some success by looking to biology and other natural systems to come up with new ideas for optimization. But in recent years, this seems to have hit a bit of a brick wall, and the new optimizers which have been produced by this process seem to be pretty much retreading old ground. So perhaps using bio-inspired optimizers isn't the best way of exploring this entire design space. On the other hand, I think work that's been done in hyperheuristics using evolutionary algorithms to design optimizers is very interesting. Typically, this uses things like GP to redesign bits of the optimizer, particularly to specialize existing optimizers to particular problem instances. But this tends to result in optimizers which are quite similar to existing ones because that's kind of the procedure. But there's no reason why things like GP couldn't be applied to exploring this design space more generally by attempting to design optimizers from scratch. And this is pretty much what I'm trying to do in this work. I'm using PushGP for this. So PushGP is a GP framework which was developed by Lee Spector and his colleagues. And it uses a stack-based language called Push, which is designed to be relatively evolvable. And so all programs have access to a bunch of stacks, and there's a separate stack for each of the types within the system. And the instructions themselves are also typed. One of the nice things about Push is that all programs are syntactically valid, which gets rid of issues with penalizing programs and sorted operators. So as well as being fairly evolvable, this system is quite expressive. So it can do things like conditional execution and loops and things by using an execution stack. I've been using a Java-based implementation called Push and adapting this. One of the changes I made is to add a new type called vector, which is intended to be used for storing and manipulating search points. So a search point within a continuous landscape is basically a fixed length vector. And there's also a bunch of new instructions that the push program can use to manipulate these. So the idea is that a push program is evolved, and then this is then used to guide a trajectory across an optimization landscape. So here's a very simple example of an optimization landscape with 2 dimensions and a gradient left to right. So the good solutions are over here and the bad ones over here. And this program is going to be used to guide a trajectory across this space. So when the optimizers first run, it's given an initial search point or multiple search points if it's a population-based optimizer. And this is copied into the vector stack of the program along with its objective value. So it has some context. The program is then executed, and this will change the stack contents in some way. And the output of the program is taken to be the thing at the top of the vector stack. And this is then taken as the next search point. So let's move from this point over to this point. And the procedure is then repeated again. So the new search point is evaluated, the value copied into the float stack. And at this point, the program also receives a couple of signals. One is whether the last move was improving. Another one is whether it's moved out of bounds. And you can find details in the pseudocode in the paper. And then the program is executed again, and this is done repeatedly until the optimizer exhausts its evaluation budget. And then hopefully it'll be somewhere near the optima. So that was a local optimizer, so one point of search. But it's also possible to evolve optimizers with multiple points of search. And these broadly follow the swarm model, where each trajectory here is a search process, and these kind of run the same program, but they have their own internal state, and they follow their own route through the search space. And it's possible for these to communicate with each other using a couple of extra instructions called vector.best and vector.current. So this green process here has 2 on the stack, and it calls vector.current. This calls it to look up the current location of search process index 2, and they're all numbered. And this will then look up the current location and copy it into the green guy's vector stack. So this provides a mechanism for them to build up collaborative behavior within the population. So this approach has been applied in this paper to evolve the optimizers for 5 different continuous function landscapes, which are all taken from the CEC 2005 benchmarks. And these are primarily selected with diversity in mind. So this function here is a relatively easy unimodal landscape. This one here has lots of concentric ellipses, and it has very little global gradient information, so it's much harder. However, during the course of evaluating optimizers, search points within these spaces get evaluated over and over again, and this is obviously very expensive. So for practical reasons, these are also chosen with evaluation time in mind. So in this work, well, so far, each of these optimizers has been trained on a single function, and its fitness during training is the mean error from the global minimum for that problem, averaged over 5 repeats from different initial conditions. And for each optimizer run, each optimizer evaluation, it gets 1,000 function evaluations, so it can sample 1,000 places within the landscape. And they're trained on 10-dimensional problems. And to discourage the optimizers from overfitting the landscape they're trained on, the problem is adapted each time an optimizer is evaluated. Random translations, scalings, and axis flips are applied to each of the dimensions. So the idea is that although it's trained on a single landscape, it will get some kind of generality. And I evolved optimizers of 4 different configurations, so 4 different population sizes that split the evaluation budget in different ways. So local search optimizers have a population of 1, and it can do 1,000 moves. Population of 5 is similar to an evolution strategy, so these guys can do 200 moves per search process. And then these larger populations are more typical of PSO or GAs. And for each of these, for each problem, I carried out 50 independent runs of PushGP, and each of these small lines shows the best optimizer from a particular run, its fitness, and low values are better. And then this bigger line shows the mean of the distribution. So this is for F1, which is the relatively simple landscape. And you can see here, these local optimizers are doing much better on average than the population-based optimizers. Although interestingly, the best optimizer found was one with a population of 5. So these plots also show the how well differential evolution and CMA-ES did on the same problem. These numbers are taken from the literature. And you can see here that CMA-ES does very well on this simple landscape, yet one of the evolved optimizers does slightly better. And if we look at the other problems, the harder problems, you can see here it's kind of less clear cut which configuration is doing best. But for these top two, the local optimizers still have a better mean and they produce the best optimizers. For this one down here, F12, a population of 5 seems to be optimal. And for this problem, which is probably the hardest, very little gradient information, as I said earlier, it seems to be the only one where there's an advantage to using larger populations. So these outliers down here are the best solutions from all the runs. And you can also see for each of these that there are lots of evolved optimizers which are doing better than CMA-ES and DE on these particular problems. However, how well an optimizer does on the problem which it was trained is arguably not that interesting. So it's also interesting to see what happens when we reevaluate these best optimizers on other problems. So the best optimizers are the ones circled in red, which have the minimum errors or the least errors. So each of these is reevaluating all the functions. And this last column shows the mean rank among these 7 algorithms. And you can see that the F12 best is actually doing pretty much the same as CMA-ES across all these problems, which is kind of interesting. That's slightly worse if you discount the problem it was trained on. But even more interesting is when they're reevaluated on the same functions of 30 dimensions, that the F12 best does better than CMA-ES. So this is kind of unexpected that an optimizer trained on a single landscape at 10 dimensions does better than this general purpose optimizer on these 5 problems at 30 dimensions, which is much harder. So it seems that although they're trained on a single landscape, these random transformations which are applied to the landscape seem sufficient to cause general optimizers to be evolved. So next I'm going to take a closer look at some of these optimizers. I'm going to start with F13 best here, which you see does best on 3 of the 5 problems, although it does worse on the other 2. And this is also interesting because it's the simplest of the best evolved optimizers. It has only 9 instructions. And this animation here is going to show it being evaluated on the F9 landscape, on which it wasn't trained at 2 dimensions, because it's hard to visualize 10 dimensions. And if I speed it up a bit, you'll see this trajectory moving through the landscape. And you see it's managing to successfully jump over these local optimum basins within the landscape. If I go over here, you see it kind of finds the target. And then if I let it keep going, you see it builds up this cross-shaped structure around the current point. So this is showing that it's doing independent moves in each dimension. But the interesting thing is that the size of this neighborhood is determined by applying the sign function to the current objective value. So the size of this neighborhood is going to change as it moves through the landscape kind of cyclically, which seems a bit odd, but seems to be quite effective. Moving on to the F12 best optimizer. This one's far more complicated, it has 25 instructions. And it has a population of 5, which are represented by different colors here. And if I let this play, you'll see that these search processes move through the landscape in quite a different way. And it's hard to see what's going on, but if I speed it up a bit, go to the end, you see it's building up this weird shape around the current search point. It's basically sampling points around here, 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 and out here somewhere. So it's kind of a power series of neighborhoods, and it's gradually moving inwards from those neighborhoods. So it's a kind of variable neighborhood search, which seems to be effective across different landscapes because it allows it to scale to different features and different overall landscape sizes. And then finally for F14, this was the best optimizer. And as I said earlier, this was the only problem on which larger populations seem to be best. This has a population of 25. I let it play. You'll see this behaves much more like a swarm algorithm, and these search processes are doing things together. So they're basically looking up the current best, and then they're sampling a point between somewhere in their own trajectory and this current best of the population. And the point they start from their own trajectory is actually taken from somewhere in the past, and how far back in the past depends on the process number. And this seems to allow them to kind of backtrack, at least parts of the population to backtrack and deal with this complex landscape with lots of hazards. So that's quite an interesting optimizer. And those are just three of the, I think, 1,000 that I evolved, and looking at how they sample their landscapes, as these plots here show, for a selection of them, shows that they explore these landscapes in really different ways, and there's loads of diversity within these solutions. So lots of potentially interesting knowledge there, perhaps. I'll play one more. And this is one that uses a population of 50. And you see it has these fairly independent walkers which move across the landscape and adapt their move sizes as they go along. It's kind of interesting. It's nice shapes, at least. And it has a loop and a conditional execution statement, so it's quite hard to understand. Not that I really tried yet. Okay, so to summarize, so it does seem that PushGP can be used to evolve optimization behaviors that are effective, complex and diverse. And the ones that I looked at seem to approach optimization in interesting ways, ways which are somewhat different to existing optimizers. And certainly it seems that we could look at these optimizers, extract knowledge, and apply these within a design of new meta-heuristics, or add them to existing meta-heuristics. I found it interesting that there was no real advantage to population-based optimizers. They sometimes do better, but local optimizers seem to do fairly well across all the problems, which I wasn't really expecting. But maybe that's just because I come from a population-based optimizer background, and we tend to underestimate local optimizers, which actually do quite well in many situations. But I suspect it's also the case that population-based optimizers are more difficult to evolve, because you also have to evolve the coordination between the search processes, which is kind of more complicated. The original idea was to kind of explore this broader design space. And in future work, I hope to kind of go about mapping this design space in a more systematic way. I'm not entirely sure how I'll approach this yet, but a couple of possibilities are to use something like a map elites plot, using some features of the optimizer's trajectories, or perhaps to do some kind of clustering within lots of diverse populations, although this will require some kind of distance metric between the trajectories, which I haven't come up with yet. Given the diversity within the populations, I think building ensembles might also be interesting. And certainly in initial work where I've looked at this, it seems that groups of weak optimizers can be formed into a kind of mixed ensemble population, which has a much stronger behavior, kind of how random forests work in classification. And there's also a need for better benchmarking, both to evaluate these optimizers and as a basis for which problems to train them on. Sampling from these benchmark sets is perhaps not the best approach, because these tend to be constructed in a fairly biased and ad hoc way. So maybe it would be better to use some kind of tunable fitness landscape for this. Anyway, that's all for now. Thanks for listening.
So thank you, Michael. Thank you for your interesting talk. I see that we have a couple of questions here. Leo started with a question that was already answered in the slides, but in fact, I had exactly the same question that was concerned. How did you represent the solutions in PushGP? But I see that, as Leo says, it's a sequence of instructions, not a sequence of solutions. There is a comment by Dan van den Berg. I apologize if I'm not saying it correctly. So the comment goes as this: there might be an explanation why single landscape trained optimizers perform well on other landscapes too. We had a short talk by Merlin de Jong yesterday that showed optimal parameterizations for different landscapes. Optimal parameterizations for different landscapes are identical. Or well, that's not really an explanation, but maybe a suggestion that there is a semi-uniform property set for nearly all problems. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I didn't see that talk, but it'd be interesting to look back at it. So I guess the no free lunch theory doesn't say that there's not one algorithm that's going to do well across all continuous landscapes, although it does kind of hint in that direction. Yeah, but these results do seem to suggest that optimizers are transferable to an extent. To what degree, I don't really know yet.
Could you repeat that, please? I didn't quite catch it. Could you repeat that, please?
Okay, so it's kind of unclear how well an optimizer is going to generalize. I think the no free lunch doesn't actually say that one optimizer can't be best across all continuous optimization landscapes. It's more general than that. But the feeling we get from previous results is that a single optimizer probably won't be optimal across all of these landscapes, and we would need some kind of diversity. But if this works suggesting otherwise, I'd be very interested to hear.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we have a couple of more questions. We have one question by Ting. Ting is, thanks, Michael, for the nice talk. Are there any particular properties of PushGP that make it preferable to evolve optimizers, especially comparing to other GP variants?
Mm-hmm. I guess it's this kind of combination of apparent evolvability and expressiveness, which you may also get in other GP systems. I did consider using grammatical evolution, but there's the extra difficulty of choosing which language to use and which subset of language. And actually, I was always interested in trying out PushGP, and this was just a nice opportunity to do so. Because this was kind of a research project I was doing in my spare time in between other academic stuff. So I focused on things that I was interested in.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. So we have another question by Douglas Diaz. Are you considering to evolve single optimizers for all the benchmarks?
I don't think so. I think it'd be better to find some kind of maybe like orthogonal basis within this landscape set. As I said, maybe using tunable landscapes to identify these. There was an interesting paper recently on these kind of tunable landscapes. I forget the authors, but I don't think using existing benchmarks and doing exhaustive coverage of those is the best approach, because they do have a lot of bias in the way they cover types of landscapes.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple of more questions. So we have another one by Valentino Santucci. It says, very interesting work. What happens if seed solution is initialized with a postcode differential evolution or CMA-ES? Is that possible?
Yeah, it should be possible. It's something I thought about doing, but I was kind of interested in exploring parts of the design space which haven't been explored before. And I suppose that would tend to bring it towards variants of existing optimizers, which would be interesting too, but not quite what I was pushing at.
Okay, we have another question by Mark Schwanauer. So he says, very nice work. I missed this, but do all Evolve optimizers use random?
I'm not quite sure what's meant by random there. They all use random initial locations, if that's what you're asking, Mark.
Okay. There is also another part to the question, also regarding benchmarking, 1000 FE. FE is a small number for CMA-ES in dimension 10, not to mention 30. For small budgets, you should probably compare to Bayesian optimization. And the final comment, it seems that most of your benchmark functions are separable, except at least F14. Did you try the rotated functions rather than only translations?
Okay, yeah. So you're right. 1,000 functional evaluations is a relatively small number, though it's one of the standards for this benchmark set. But this was really because I only had one computer to run these experiments on, and I didn't have the resources to run 10,000 function evaluations, for instance. But yeah, I guess compare against Bayesian optimization might be interesting too. I don't think they were all separable. I forget the details. If you look in the paper, it describes the ones I chose in more detail. I probably avoided the more complex functions because they were a lot slower to evaluate, and time was a big issue for this, time and resources.
Okay, so Mark clarified the question about the Evolve optimizers using random. So the question is if they use random after initialization during the search.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yes, they do. So they generate random vectors of different sizes and things like that, and random floats as well.
Okay. So Leonardo has a question that is in line with Valentino's one, which says, can the push population be initialized with the existing algorithms?
Well, I'll expand on the previous answer and say, yes, you could write anything in push because it's a complete language. It may be hard. Getting your head around push can be a bit difficult.
It's possible, but you don't say how.
Yeah, it takes a while to get your head around push. I've been trying to interpret these programs. It's usually possible after some time looking at them, but interpretability is they are interpretable, but it takes a bit of effort.
Okay. So if there are no more questions, I would like to thank you again for this interesting talk and for the interesting work. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.